Wild Bill Hickok was the most famous gunfighter in the West, and most of what made him famous never happened. This is the true story, the legend buried. You're at Western Pioneer Archives, where we dig the real people out from underneath their legends. If that's your kind of history, subscribe and ride along with us. The man at the center of this story was real. James Butler Hickok was born on the Illinois prairie in 1837 and died with a bullet in the back of his head 39 years later in a lawless gold camp called Deadwood. In between, he became something brand new in America. He was the first gunfighter the mass media ever manufactured, a household name built on a body count that never happened, sold to a grieving country that was desperate to believe in him. Some of those lies were told about him, the most outrageous ones, he told himself, and nearly every one of them can be checked right now against a document the legend hoped you would never read: a coroner's note, a trial record, a subpoena, a newspaper from the week it happened. Here is the legend, the way it has come down to us for 150 years. Wild Bill Hickok was the deadliest man who ever lived in the American West. A pistolier without equal. A gunfighter who killed his first men at a lonely stage station in Nebraska, where he stood alone against an outlaw gang 10 strong, armed only with a revolver, a rifle, and a Bowie knife, and cut them all down, taking 11 bullets and 13 knife wounds, and living to tell it. The greatest one-man gunfight in the history of the frontier. They said he had killed hundreds of men. They printed it in a national magazine with his own face on the cover, and the number was not a misprint. Hundreds by his own hand. Of that, the writer said, he had not a doubt. They said he could shoot a coin out of the air, drill a man clean through the heart at 75 yards, drop 2 attackers at once with a pistol in each hand. They said he was the law in the worst cattle towns on the plains, that outlaws crossed the street when they saw him coming, that he wore his hair long and his pistols backward and his coat like a gentleman, and that death followed him the way a shadow follows a tall man at sunset. They said that when he finally fell, shot from behind by a coward in a Deadwood saloon, he was holding a hand of cards so famous it has its own name to this day. 2 aces, 2 eights, black, the dead man's hand. That is the legend. Almost every piece of it can be checked against a document. A coroner's note, a trial record, a subpoena, a newspaper from the week it happened. And when you lay the legend down next to the paper, something remarkable happens. The story does not just shrink. It changes into a different story altogether, a stranger one, a sadder one, and in some ways a far more human one than the dime novels ever dared to print. Because the truth is that Wild Bill Hickok did not kill hundreds of men. By the careful count of the historian who spent his life on the records, James Butler Hickok killed 6 men in personal fights and is suspected of a 7th. 6. Not in a single legendary battle, but spread across 10 hard years. The truth is that the famous gunfight at the stage station was not a battle against an outlaw gang at all, and at least 3 of the men who died there were almost certainly unarmed. The truth is that the one duel he fought that actually looked like the legend, the slow walk and the single shot in the public square, is famous precisely because almost nothing else in the West ever happened that way. And the truth is that the man who built the legend of Wild Bill was not only the writers and the newspapers who got rich on him. It was, in no small part, Wild Bill himself. This is the story of how a real man became the first gunfighter the mass media ever manufactured. And it is the story of the documents that have been quietly telling the truth the whole time, if only we would read them. To understand how one man could be turned into a legend in his own lifetime, you have to understand the country he was born into. Because the machine that built Wild Bill Hickok was running long before he ever drew a pistol. James Butler Hickok was born on the 27th of May, 1837, in the little town of Homer, Illinois, now called Troy Grove, out on the north-central prairie of a young and violent state. His father, William Alonzo Hickok, was a farmer and an abolitionist, a man who hated slavery enough to risk his home for it. The family house, long since gone, is said to have served as a station on the Underground Railroad, a hiding place for men and women running north out of bondage. So the boy grew up with a secret in the cellar and a sense very early that the law of the land and the right thing to do were not always the same thing. That lesson would shape everything that came after. And the Illinois of his boyhood was not a settled, orderly place. It was frontier, raw and recent, and into the timber and prairie of the northern counties had come a loose web of outlaw gangs that the terrified settlers called the banditti of the prairie. House burglars, horse and cattle thieves, counterfeiters, highway robbers, murderers. In some counties they grew so numerous and so well connected that honest men could not get a conviction in a courtroom because the jury itself had been salted with the gang's own friends. In one county, it was said, nearly every township officer was a member. When the law failed, the settlers did what frightened people on the edge of a map have always done. They made their own law. They formed vigilante bands and called themselves regulators, and they whipped and they drove out, and when their blood was up, they killed. In the summer of 1841, 4 years after Hickok was born and a few counties over from his cradle, the regulators of Ogle County dragged two brothers named Driscoll out before a crowd of 500 people. They formed a kangaroo court. They picked a jury of more than 100 men from the crowd. They found the Driscolls guilty of murder in a matter of hours, and then they divided themselves into 2 firing squads, 55 men in one line and 56 in the other, and shot the 2 men to death where they stood, so that no single bullet could ever be traced to a single hand. That was justice on the Illinois frontier the year Wild Bill was learning to walk. A boy raised in that country learned that violence and law were not opposites. They were neighbors. Sometimes they were the same men. And here is the part that matters most for the story we are telling. That violent frontier was already learning to turn itself into a product. When the dust settled on one of those Illinois outlaw sagas, a self-styled detective named Edward Bonney, who had helped hunt down a band of frontier killers, sat down and wrote a book about it, a lurid, breathless, paper-bound account with a title built to sell, calling it Banditti of the Prairies, or The Murderer's Doom. It came out in 1850 when Hickok was a boy of 13, and it was exactly the kind of thing the country was beginning to crave. Real frontier violence, packaged and dramatized and sold to readers safe in their parlors back east. The appetite was already there and growing years before James Hickok ever fired a shot in anger. The frontier was not only making violent men, it was making the market that would buy them, the printing presses that would inflate them, and the hunger that would swallow them whole. Hickok was not the first product of that machine, but he would become its masterpiece. That same restless country was already learning to tell stories about itself and to sell them. 60 years before Hickok, another long hunter had walked west out of the same kind of forest, a Pennsylvania-born wanderer named Daniel Boone, and Boone had become something new in American life, not just a frontiersman, but a character, a printed legend. By the time Hickok was a boy, Boone had been dead for years, but the books about him had not died at all. They had multiplied, each one a little taller than the last, until the real surveyor and trapper had nearly disappeared behind a buckskin idol who could do no wrong. The frontier, it turned out, was not only a place, it was a product, and the country east of the Mississippi was hungry to buy it. Into that hungry country, in the 1850s, came the thing that would make the boy from Troy Grove a man and very nearly a killer before he was 20. The question of slavery had reached the territories, and Kansas had become its battlefield. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had thrown open the question of whether the new land would be slave or free, and instead of settling it with votes, both sides settled it with rifles. They called it Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery men poured across the line from Missouri. Anti-slavery men, the Free Soilers and the Jayhawkers, poured in to meet them. Before the violence burned down, more than 50 men were dead, and the whole nation could see, in that one bleeding territory, the shape of the catastrophe that was coming. In 1855, 18 years old and a fugitive, James Hickok walked into the middle of it. He had fled Illinois after a brawl with another young man, both of them tumbling into a canal, each one convinced he had drowned the other. He came to Kansas, and the son of the abolitionist did exactly what you would expect. He joined General Jim Lane's Free State Army, the anti-slavery vigilante fighters known as the Jayhawkers, and there, in the chaos of bleeding Kansas, a tall, red-haired teenager fell in with a boy of 12 named William Cody, who would one day be known across the world as Buffalo Bill. The two of them, the future legend and the future showman who would help sell him, met as a young man and a child in the most violent corner of the country. Their lives would braid together and pull apart for the next 20 years, and one of them would still be alive at the end to shape how the other was remembered. Then came the war. The American Civil War, which began in April of 1861 and did not end until the spring of 1865, was the deadliest thing this country has ever done to itself. Some 700,000 men died, and along the Missouri and Kansas border, where Hickok spent the war, it was not the clean war of battle lines and bugle calls that you read about at Gettysburg or Antietam. It was a guerrilla war, the dirtiest kind, a war of raiders and bushwhackers and midnight ambushes, of men like William Quantrill riding into a town and burning it to the ground and murdering its men in the street, of neighbor informing on neighbor, of barns torched and wells poisoned, and old scores settled under the cover of a flag. The border between Kansas and Missouri became a country of the dead, where the line between soldier and outlaw, between patriot and murderer, simply dissolved. Hickok served the Union through all of it in a dozen different roles. He was a teamster hauling supplies, then a wagon master in charge of the trains. He scouted, and he spied, by some accounts slipping into Confederate country in disguise, even, his friend Cody would later claim, masquerading as a rebel officer to gather what he could and slip back out again. Whatever the exact shape of his service, it was the schooling of a particular kind of man. He came out the other end of that war in 1865 the way an entire generation of American men came out of it, hardened, easy around weapons in a way that would have horrified their grandfathers, accustomed to the sight and the doing of killing, and then turned loose all at once into a country that suddenly had no use for armies and a frontier that was wide open, booming, and very nearly without law. This is the soil the legend grew in, and it is worth lingering on because the men who would buy the legend were every bit as important as the man who would become it. Consider the country as it stood in 1866. 500,000 men dead or maimed. Every other family in mourning. A nation that had spent 4 years reading casualty lists so long the newspapers printed them in tiny type to fit them all in. People were sick to the soul of the kind of death the war had served them. The anonymous, industrial, meaningless death of a farm boy cut down by a cannonball he never saw, one of 10,000 that day, his name misspelled in a list. And into that grief and that exhaustion came a new kind of story, and it sold like nothing had ever sold before. The story of the single man, not the faceless soldier in the trench, but one brave figure standing alone in a dusty street, his fate and the town's fate riding on his own steady nerve and his own quick hand. It was the exact opposite of the war. It was death made meaningful again, death made personal and clean and heroic, and a wounded country was starving for it. There was already a whole industry standing ready to feed that hunger. The dime novels, cheap paper-bound adventures churned out by the hundreds of thousands, had been building frontier heroes for years, taking real men like Boone and Kit Carson and inflating them into supermen. The big Eastern magazines wanted the same thing dressed up a little finer for a richer audience. The newspapers wanted it most of all because a good gunfighter sold papers the way a good war had. There was money, real money, in turning a frontiersman into a god. All the machine lacked was a fresh face, a living man with a name like a gunshot who would sit still long enough to be made into a myth. And in the summer of 1865, in a dusty square in Springfield, Missouri, the man walked out into the open and gave them exactly what they were waiting for. This is the soil the legend grew in, a nation exhausted by 4 years of slaughter, sick of casualty lists, and starving for a different kind of story. Not the anonymous death of a soldier in a trench, but the bright, clean myth of a single brave man with a pistol, standing alone, deciding the fate of a town with his own steady hand. The newspapers knew it. The magazine editors back east knew it. The publishers of the cheap paper-bound adventures, the dime novels, knew it best of all. They had built Daniel Boone. They had built Kit Carson. They were ready to build somebody new, somebody alive, somebody with a face they could put on a cover and a name that sounded like a thunderclap. All they needed was the man. And in the summer of 1865, in a dusty square in Springfield, Missouri, the man walked into the open and gave them exactly what they were waiting for. But to understand that moment and the lie that grew out of it, we have to go back 4 years to a lonely stage station on a creek in Nebraska and to the gunfight that the legend got the most wrong of all. Before he was Wild Bill, he was nobody in particular. After bleeding Kansas, the young Hickok took up the ordinary work of an ambitious frontierman on the make. In 1857, at 20, he claimed 160 acres in Johnson County, Kansas, near what is now Lenexa, and the next spring his neighbors elected him one of the first constables of Monticello Township. It is worth stopping on that because it is the first thing the legend leaves out. The deadliest gunman in the West began his public life not as an outlaw or a duelist, but as a small-town lawman counting his acres, a young constable on the prairie trying to build a life. There is no body count here. There is a survey stake and a ballot. He was, by all accounts, a striking young man and worth seeing clearly before the legend painted over him. He had been a fine shot since boyhood, recognized around home as an outstanding hand with a pistol, a real and verifiable skill that the myth would later inflate into the supernatural, but did not have to invent. He was tall and lean and carried himself with a kind of theatrical pride, wearing his hair long to his shoulders and dressing, when he could afford to, like a frontier dandy, in fine coats and fancy shirts. There is one small detail that tells you how completely even his appearance has come down to us distorted. In every photograph that survives, Hickok seems to have dark hair, but everyone who actually saw him agreed that his hair was red. The early cameras simply could not see the color red and rendered it dark, so that the very pictures we have of the man lie to us about something as basic as the color of his head. It is a fitting thing to know about Wild Bill Hickok. Even the photographs misremember him. He needed money more than he needed land, and in 1859 he went to work for the great freighting firm of Russell, Majors and Waddell, the same company that would soon launch the Pony Express, that brief and doomed relay of horsemen carrying the mail across 1,900 miles of wilderness. Hickok drove their wagons, and it was hard and dangerous work. The freight roads of the late 1850s ran out across some of the loneliest and most hazardous country on the continent. The long hauls between Missouri and Santa Fe and beyond, weeks at a stretch in open prairie and high desert, exposed to storms and stampedes and the very real chance of attack. A teamster lived rough, slept under his wagon, mended his own gear, and trusted his life to his rifle and his nerve. It was the school that made the frontiersman, and Hickok came up through it, a young man learning the country and the weapons and the hard arithmetic of survival in places where help was 100 miles away. And it is here, on those long and dangerous hauls, that we meet the first of his own tall tales. According to the story Hickok told, sometime around 1860, he was driving a freight team toward Santa Fe when he found the road blocked by an enormous cinnamon bear and her cubs. He got down. He walked up to the bear and shot it in the head. The bullet glanced off its skull. The enraged animal fell on him and crushed him, and Hickok, pinned and dying, managed to get a hand on his knife and cut the bear's throat. Now, something happened to Hickok in 1860. That part is solid. He was badly hurt, crushed in the chest and shoulder and arm, hurt so seriously that he was bedridden for 4 months and could not do a freighter's heavy labor afterward. To let him heal, the company sent him to a quiet posting at one of their relay stations, a stage stop and Pony Express station on Rock Creek in the Nebraska Territory, near present-day Fairbury. It is worth understanding what that place actually was, because the setting matters to everything that followed. The Pony Express was one of the great romantic gambles of the American frontier, a relay of fearless young riders carrying the mail 1,900 miles between Missouri and California at a dead gallop, changing horses every 10 or 15 miles at little stations strung out across the prairie and the mountains. It captured the imagination of the whole country, and it lasted barely a year and a half before the transcontinental telegraph made it obsolete and it collapsed into bankruptcy, a legend almost from the moment it began. Rock Creek was one of those stations, a humble link in that famous chain, sitting on the Oregon Trail where thousands of emigrant wagons creaked westward toward new lives. It was not a fort. It was a cabin, a well, a barn, a corral, and a handful of rough men keeping the horses fed and the mail moving. And it was here, at this small and ordinary outpost of one of the most romantic enterprises in frontier history, that the legend of the West's deadliest gunman would be born out of an argument over an unpaid bill. The injury is real. The 4 months in bed are real. But the single-handed knife fight with a wounded grizzly that supposedly put him there is exactly the kind of story that would later make him famous, and it comes down to us mostly on his own word. Keep that in your mind as we go. The pattern is already forming. Real event, real wound, and wrapped around it a story just a little too perfect, told by a man who understood, even then, the value of a good story about himself. At Rock Creek, the legend of Wild Bill Hickok was about to be born, and it would be born out of something small and squalid and entirely unheroic. A money dispute, a man recovering from injury who was being teased about how he looked. The land at Rock Creek had been bought from a local rancher named David Colbert McCanley's. McCanley's was a former sheriff out of Watauga County, North Carolina, a big, strong, capable man, and by most accounts, a hard one. He had a reputation as a local bully. He had leased the cabin and well on the east side of the creek to the freight company for use as a relay station, and the company had agreed to pay him for the land in installments. And here is the engine of the whole tragedy. The company fell behind on the payments. That is the entire root of it. Not an outlaw raid, not a Confederate plot, a late check. McCandless was the kind of restless, grasping frontier operator who turns up again and again in these stories. He had come west out of North Carolina, and he had a sharp eye for a dollar. He had owned ranch property in the area, bought and sold land, and at one point owned a toll bridge that he reportedly sold and reclaimed and sold again, each time on terms designed to fall back into his hands. He was, in short, a man used to getting his way in a money dispute, and the freight company's failure to pay him on time was the kind of thing that, for a man like McCandless, could not be allowed to stand. There may have been more between him and Hickok than money, too. One account holds that part of the bad blood was personal, that Hickok had taken up with a woman McCandless considered his own, a frontier triangle layered on top of the debt. The records here are thin and tangled, and an honest telling has to admit it. But whatever the exact mix of money and pride and jealousy, by the summer of 1861, the air at Rock Creek was charged, and a big, hard man who was owed money had begun riding to the station to lean on the men who worked there and to amuse himself by tormenting the hurt young stable hand he called Duck Bill. You should know, too, that the story of what happened at Rock Creek has been told in wildly different ways almost from the first day, and the contradictions are part of the truth. One of the earliest accounts, set down by two men who reached the ranch within hours of the killings, claimed that McCandless's brother was a Southern sympathizer who had tried to recruit Hickok to the rebel cause and turn over the company's horses, and that the visit to the station was an attempt to make good on a threat. Other accounts make no mention of any such thing and describe a simple, brutal debt collection gone wrong. The versions disagree about who stood in the doorway and who stood inside, about whether McCandless was lured in or forced in, about exactly which weapon Hickok used. This is what real history looks like when you get close to it. Not a clean scene with a clear villain, but a smear of conflicting memories and competing interests, every teller with a reason to shade the story his own way. What does not change across all the honest versions is the body count and the manner of the deaths. 3 men dead, 1 shot from concealment, 2 of them unarmed and finished by other hands. That is the bedrock the legend was poured over. While Hickok was recovering at the station as a stock tender, a young man of 23 with a crushed shoulder, McCandless took to mocking him. He teased Hickok about his build, which he found girlish, and about his face, the long nose, and the full protruding upper lip, and he hung a nickname on him that Hickok would spend the rest of his life trying to bury. He called him Duck Bill. That is the man the legend would later turn into a fearless avenger. In the summer of 1861, he was a hurt stable hand being called Duck Bill by the landlord, and he hated it. On the 12th of July, 1861, David McCandless rode to the station to collect the overdue payment. He did not come alone, and this is the detail the legend would inflate beyond all recognition. He brought 3 other people: his 12-year-old son, Monroe, his cousin, James Woods, and an employee named James Gordon. 4 human beings, one of them a child, riding up to a station to demand a debt. That is the outlaw gang of the dime novels: a father, a boy, a cousin, and a hired hand. What happened next is genuinely uncertain in its small details, and the honest thing to do is to tell you so. There are several versions, and they disagree about who stood where and who said what. But the core of it, drawn from the court records and from the eyewitness who survived, is brutally clear. McCandless came to the station to see the manager, Horace Wellman, and to get his money. Hard words passed. At some point, McCandless, or someone, stepped toward the cabin, and inside the cabin, behind a curtain, behind a blanket hung up to divide the room, was Hickok with a rifle. He took McCandless's own rifle down from the wall or used his pistol, the accounts differ, and he fired through or around that curtain, and David McCandless fell dead in the doorway. His 12-year-old son saw it happen. Then it became a slaughter and not a duel. James Woods and James Gordon, McCandless' cousin and his hired man, were unarmed. The surviving witness was always firm on that point. They were unarmed, and when the shooting started, they tried to run. Hickok stepped out of the cabin and wounded both of them with his pistols. He did not, however, finish them. Woods was killed by the station manager's wife, or the manager himself, with a garden hoe, hacked to death in the open. Gordon was run down and killed with a shotgun by another station employee, a man named James Brink, and the boy, Monroe, 12 years old and watching his father and his kinsman die, ran. He fled down a dry creek bed and across the miles to his home to tell his mother that her husband was dead. 3 men were killed at Rock Creek that day, not 10, not 9, 3. One of them shot from behind a curtain, 2 of them unarmed and finished with a hoe and a shotgun by men whose names the legend would never mention, because a hoe is not the stuff of legend. This was not the greatest one-man gunfight in the history of the West. It was a debt collection that ended in 3 corpses, at least 2 of them defenseless, and a 12-year-old running for his life. There is a deeper truth here that modern historians have come to, and it is worth saying plainly. The McCandless gang, the fearsome band of outlaws that Wild Bill supposedly destroyed, very likely never existed at all. There is no good evidence that David McCandless led a gang of horse thieves and murderers, no record of the train robberies and cattle rustling and killings later attributed to his band. McCandless was a hard man and a bully, by the accounts we have, but a bully is not an outlaw chief, and a cousin and a hired hand and a 12-year-old boy are not a gang of desperados. The careful conclusion of the people who have studied the records most closely is that the victims of Rock Creek were, in all probability, innocent men whose only real crime was to cross paths with James Butler Hickok on a bad day over a debt. The gang was invented later, conjured out of thin air to give the killings the shape of heroism, to turn a squalid triple homicide into an epic. The most famous outlaw gang in the early legend of the West may have been a fiction from the very beginning, a villain written into the story so that the hero would have something worthy to kill. And the law saw it that way too at first. David McCandless's brother swore out a warrant. Hickok, Wellman, and Brink, the 3 station men, were arrested and brought to trial in nearby Beatrice, charged with murder. There was one witness for the prosecution who had seen everything, Monroe McCandless, the dead man's son. The boy had been subpoenaed. He was there. He was ready to swear that his father and the other 2 men had been unarmed, that they had come for money and not for blood, and the judge would not let him take the stand. He was a child, and the court ruled he could not testify. So the only voices the jury heard were the voices of the 3 station employees, who all said the same thing: self-defense, defense of the company's property. And with the one witness who could contradict them, silenced by his own age, the 3 men were acquitted, the whole proceeding reportedly lasting no more than 15 minutes. There is one more piece of the Rock Creek story, and it is the piece that tells you Hickok was not a monster, whatever else he was. According to the foreman of the company's stations, on the way to that trial in Beatrice, Hickok insisted on stopping at the McCandless' home. The widow was there, and Hickok, the man who had killed her husband, told her he was sorry he had to do it, and he took out $35, every cent he had on him, and he pressed it into her hands. "This is all I have," he told her. "Sorry, I do not have more to give you." That is not the dime novel avenger gunning down a gang of desperados. That is a young man who has done a terrible thing in a squalid quarrel, carrying his guilt to the door of the woman he widowed and emptying his pockets because it is the only thing he knows how to do. Both of those men are real, the killer and the penitent. They are the same man, and the legend would keep only the first. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that trial actually was, because it tells you as much about the frontier as any gunfight ever could. A man and his unarmed kinsman had been killed. The only person who had watched the whole thing and had no stake in the company's version was a 12-year-old boy, and the law silenced him, not because anyone proved him a liar, but because he was a child. So the only account the jury was allowed to hear was the account of the men who had done the killing. This is not a story of justice done or justice denied so much as a story of how thin and improvised justice was on the edge of the map, how easily it bent toward whoever had standing and a plausible story, how completely it could fail the dead and the powerless. The same frontier that would soon crown Hickok a hero had just shown, in a courtroom in Beatrice, exactly whose voices counted and whose did not. Monroe McCandless would carry the truth unheard for the rest of his life. It would be more than half a century before anyone with the power to spread it would finally stop and listen to what the boy had seen. McCandless may well have been the first man James Hickok ever killed. He grew a mustache after Rock Creek to hide the lip that had earned him the hated nickname, and he stopped letting men call him Duck Bill. He began, instead, to call himself Wild Bill. The name and the man were being remade in the same season, out of the same blood. It is worth noting how unstable even his name was, because it tells you something about how slippery the whole man becomes the closer you look. He had been christened James Butler Hickok. From his late teens, he sometimes went by his late father's name, William Hickok. Through the Civil War, he used the name William Hickok, and most newspapers called him Hickok as late as 1869. He was arrested under that false name after the Tutt killing, and when the famous magazine article finally made him immortal, the writer could not even spell it, calling him Hitchcock on the page. James Butler Hickok, William Hickok, William Hickok, Duck Bill, Wild Bill, Hitchcock. The man had as many names as the legend would have versions, and almost from the start, the real one kept slipping out from under all of them. Here is the strangest part, and the part that should make you sit up. For 6 years, almost nobody outside Nebraska had ever heard of the Rock Creek killings. It was a frontier quarrel, ugly and local and forgotten. The men who died, McCanley's and Woods and Gordon, were on their way to becoming a footnote. And then, 6 years later, the whole thing came roaring back to life, transformed beyond recognition in the pages of one of the most respected magazines in America. The 3 dead men became 9 bloodthirsty desperados, a whole outlaw gang. The debt dispute became a Confederate plot. The man shot from behind a curtain became a duel of titans, and Duck Bill the stable hand became Wild Bill Hickok, the deadliest pistolier who ever lived, who took on a gang of cutthroats single-handed and walked out alive over their bodies. How that happened and who made it happen is the heart of this story. But to get there, we have to follow Hickok out of the war and into a town square in Missouri, to the one fight in his whole life that came closest to matching the myth. Because the legend did not begin with a battle at all. It began, of all things, with a poker game and a stolen watch. When the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, James Hickok mustered out of the Union service in June and drifted into Springfield, Missouri, with no particular plan beyond a deck of cards. He was 28. He had spent 4 years in the guerrilla war along the border, and he had come out of it the way so many did, restless, rootless, and very good with a gun. His war had been a strange and unglamorous one, the kind of service that never made it into the dime novels because it could not be dressed up. He had hauled freight as a teamster and risen to wagon master, then been discharged for reasons no record explains, then signed on again. He had done detective work for the Provost Marshal of Southwest Missouri, which sounds dashing and was not. His duties included counting how many Union soldiers were drinking on duty, checking that the hotels had proper liquor licenses, and tracking down men who owed money to the cash-strapped army. He scouted. He may have spied behind rebel lines, and his friend Cody told a story, years later, of running into Hickok in Missouri disguised as a Confederate officer. It was useful, dangerous, dirty, anonymous work, the work of a capable man in a chaotic war, and there is not a quick draw or a noble duel anywhere in it. By the time he reached Springfield in the summer of 1865, that war was behind him, and he was simply a hard, idle young veteran with quick hands and time to kill. In Springfield, he made his living gambling, and one local history written years later described him without affection as a swaggering, hard-drinking man who liked to frighten nervous people for sport. He was not yet famous. He was just another dangerous young veteran in a town full of them, killing time at the card tables. And in those card games, he ran up against an old acquaintance named Davis Tutt. The 2 men had a tangled history. They had been friendly once, despite the fact that Tutt had worn Confederate gray while Hickok wore Union blue. Tutt came from a hard family down in Arkansas that had been chewed up by a private feud, a feud that had killed several of his kin, and he had come north after the war the way Hickok had come west, looking for a fresh start at the tables. But by the summer of 1865, the friendship had soured, and it had soured, as these things so often did, over women as much as money. There were stories that Hickok had fathered a child with Tutt's sister. There were stories that Tutt had been paying a great deal of attention to a woman Hickok considered his own. When Hickok began refusing to sit at any card table that included Tutt, Tutt struck back the only way a gambler could. He started bankrolling other players and coaching them openly on how to beat Wild Bill, trying to break him at his own game. It came to a head over a debt and a watch. On the night of the 20th of July at the Lion House Hotel, Hickok was winning. He had taken something like $200 off the table, much of it money Tutt had staked to other players, and Tutt was furious. He demanded that Hickok pay him an old debt. Hickok, agreeable enough, paid one debt of $40 on the spot. But Tutt was not satisfied, and he claimed Hickok owed him another $35 from a previous game. "No," said Hickok, "you're wrong, Dave. It is $25. I have a memorandum in my pocket." And right there, the quarrel turned, because Tutt did something calculated to humiliate. He reached down and took one of Hickok's most prized possessions off the table, a fine gold pocket watch, a Waltham repeater, and he announced to the whole room that he would keep it as collateral until the debt was paid in full. You have to understand what that meant to a professional gambler in 1865. It was not just theft. It was an accusation made in front of everyone that Hickok was a deadbeat who would not pay his debts, a man whose word at the table was worthless. For a man who lived by gambling, that insult could end his livelihood as surely as a bullet. Hickok was livid, but he was also outnumbered and outgunned in that room, Tutt's friends all around him, and so he held his temper. He asked quietly for the watch to be set back on the table. Tutt only grinned an ugly grin and walked out with the watch in his pocket. For several days, Tutt's friends worked at Hickok like men poking a chained animal. They taunted him about the watch. They wanted him to lose his head and draw in a crowded room where the whole pack of them could shoot him down and call it self-defense. And then they brought him the message that finished it. Tutt, they told him, was going to wear that watch across the public square the next day, in the open, for the whole town to see. It was the final humiliation, and it forced Hickok's hand exactly as it forced Tutt's. Hickok reportedly answered with a line, "That has the cold ring of a man who has made up his mind. He shouldn't come across that square," Hickok said, "unless dead men can walk." Then he went back to his room and cleaned and oiled and loaded his pistols. Tutt was trapped now too. Having boasted that he would wear the watch in public, he could not back down without looking like a coward, and a frontier gambler could not afford to look like a coward and go on living in the same town. So the next day, the 21st of July, 1865, both men walked toward the same square, each one unable to turn back without being unmanned in front of everyone he knew. Tutt arrived in the morning with the watch hanging openly from his pocket. Word reached Hickok within the hour. They met once and tried to settle it, even went and had a drink together, but the numbers would not reconcile, Tutt now demanding $45 and Hickok still insisting on $25. And so the drink settled nothing, and the afternoon wore on toward 6 o'clock with the whole thing still unfinished and a town holding its breath. Step back and look at the sheer madness of it. because the madness is the point. Two grown men were about to try to kill each other in front of a whole town, and the thing they could not agree on was $10. Not a blood feud, not a stolen wife or a murdered kin. $10 and a watch, and a difference of pride that neither man could find a way to set down. They had even had a drink together that very afternoon, two men who had once been friends, and still neither could walk away, because on that frontier, in that culture of honor, walking away was a kind of death too. Tutt could not fail to wear the watch without looking like he had knuckled under to Hickok's threat. Hickok could not let Tutt parade the watch without looking like a deadbeat and a coward. Each man was trapped by the audience, by the unwritten code that said a man who backed down in public was finished, and so they marched toward the square like two men sleepwalking toward a cliff, each one privately, probably, wishing there were some way out that did not cost him his standing among men. There was not. The code did not allow for it, and so a disagreement that any two reasonable people could have settled with a handshake and a $10 bill became instead the most famous duel in the history of the American West, and left one of the two men dead in the dirt before sundown. A few minutes before 6, Wild Bill Hickok walked into the square from the south, his Colt Navy revolver in his hand. The sight of him scattered the crowd into doorways and behind walls, and it left Davis Tutt standing alone in the northwest corner of the open square, perhaps 75 yards away. That is most of a football field. That is a very long way for a pistol shot in 1865. Hickok stopped. He called out across the distance. "Dave," he said, "here I am." He cocked his pistol and rested it down on his hip, and he gave Tutt one last warning. "Don't you come across here with that watch." Tutt did not answer. He stood with his hand on his own pistol, and then both men turned sideways to each other in the old dueling posture, narrowing the target, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Tutt reached for his gun. Hickok raised his Colt and steadied it across his opposite forearm, the way a careful man braces a long shot, and both pistols fired so close together that witnesses heard what sounded like a single report. Tutt's bullet went wide. Hickok's did not. It struck Tutt in the left side between the ribs, and Davis Tutt cried out, "Boys, I'm killed." He staggered up onto the courthouse porch and back down into the street, and there he fell, and there he died. Now stop and look hard at what just happened, because this is the one moment in the entire life of Wild Bill Hickok that actually matches the legend. Two men, a public square, a long pause, a fair warning, a simultaneous draw, and a single fatal shot at a distance that beggars belief. The walk down, the quick-draw duel that 10,000 Western films would later make the very symbol of the Old West. It happened. It really happened in Springfield, Missouri, in the summer of 1865. But here is the thing the movies never tell you. It is famous because it almost never happened that way, anywhere. In the whole bloody history of the frontier, the formal one-on-one quick-draw duel in a public street, the thing every Western treats as routine, is one of the rarest events on record. Men were shot in the back, shot from ambush, shot drunk across a card table, shot in a brawl in a dark saloon, shot by three men at once. They were almost never shot in a fair walk-down at high noon. The Hickok-Tutt duel did not become legendary because it was typical. It became legendary because it was a freak, a near-unique event that the storytellers seized on precisely because it was so clean and so dramatic, and then pretended was the ordinary way of the West. The single most iconic image of frontier violence is built on one of its rarest moments. And that one moment happened to a man who was about to become the most famous gunfighter in America. And it cost another man his life, a man the legend would remember only as a name to be killed. It is worth saying who Davis Tutt actually was, because he was not a villain and he was not a prop. He was a young man from Arkansas whose family had been torn apart by a long and bloody feud back home, who had worn the gray in the war and come north afterward looking like so many for a clean start at the card tables of a new town. He had been Hickok's friend once. He had a future, or might have, until a quarrel over a watch and $10 and a matter of pride trapped both men in a code that neither could escape. He died in the dirt of a courthouse square at perhaps 30 years old, and his last words were not heroic, only human. "Boys, I'm killed." Whatever he was a person, with kin who grieved him and a story of his own, and the legend would flatten him into nothing, a faceless gambler whose only purpose was to be outdrawn so that Wild Bill could be a hero. Remember him? The machine that made one man immortal did it, as it always did, by grinding another man into scenery. The law did not see it as a clean duel, though. The next day a warrant went out, and Hickok was arrested, first under the false name he had been using around town, William Hickok, for the killing of Davis Tutt. He was charged with murder, and a magistrate reduced it to manslaughter, and he posted $2,000 bail. His trial began on the 3rd of August and lasted 3 days. 22 witnesses from the square testified. It was no backwater proceeding either. Hickok was defended by a former Union military governor, Colonel John S. Phelps, and prosecuted by a major named Robert Fyan before Judge Sempronius Boyd, serious men in a serious court. And yet the actual transcripts of that trial have been lost to time, so that what we know of the most legally significant gunfight in the West comes mostly from the newspapers that covered it. The central question, the one the whole case turned on, was a question the legend never bothers with. Who fired first? Only 4 people had actually watched the shooting, and they could not agree. 2 said both men fired, but could not tell who drew first. 1 had been standing behind Hickok and could only see Hickok. Another said Tutt never fired at all, though he admitted noticing that one chamber of Tutt's pistol had been discharged. Under the strict letter of Missouri law, Hickok was in real trouble, because he had walked into that square armed and expecting to fight, and a man who goes looking for a fight cannot easily claim he killed in self-defense. The judge, a man named Sempronius Boyd, actually told the jury as much. He instructed them, in plain language, that if Hickok had been willing to engage in the fight, the law required them to convict. And then, in the very same breath, Judge Boyd gave them a second instruction that pointed the other way entirely. If they believed Tutt was a dangerous man and that he had been advancing with a drawn pistol, then they could apply the unwritten law of the fair fight and acquit. He had handed the jury permission to ignore the written law if their sense of frontier honor told them to, and after deliberating an hour or two, that is exactly what they did. They found Wild Bill Hickok not guilty. The verdict was not popular. The people of Springfield knew that a man had been killed over a poker debt and a wristwatch, and many of them did not think that justified shooting him dead in the public square. A prominent local attorney climbed up onto the courthouse balcony and denounced the verdict to the crowd as against the evidence and against all decency, and for a while there was even talk of lynching Hickok. As one historian would later put it, Nothing better described those times than the simple fact that dangling a watch held as security for a poker debt was widely regarded as a justifiable reason to start shooting. So that is the truth of the famous duel, a killing over $20 and a watch, an acquittal that half the town despised, a man set free more by the unwritten code of the frontier than by the written law. It should have been a small and sordid story, soon forgotten like Rock Creek before it. Instead, within weeks, a stranger arrived in Springfield, sought Hickok out, and began asking questions. He was a writer for a famous magazine, and he was about to take this dusty, ambiguous, half-disgraced killing and turn it, and the man who did it, into a national myth. His name was George Ward Nichols, and he is the man who, more than any other single person, invented Wild Bill Hickok. Nichols was a colonel, a Union veteran who had served under Sherman, and he was a writer. And in September of 1865, only weeks after the Tutt trial, he came to Springfield and found James Hickok and began to interview him. What Nichols took away from those conversations, and what he did with it, would set the template for American celebrity violence for the next century and a half. The article ran in February of 1867 in Harper's New Monthly magazine, one of the most widely read and respected periodicals in the country. It was simply titled Wild Bill, and it was, from top to bottom, a fabulation. Nichols could not even get the name right. He called his hero William Hitchcock through much of the piece, so that the article that made James Butler Hickok immortal could not correctly print the name of the man it was immortalizing, and the portrait it painted was not of a human being at all. Nichols described a creature of almost mythological proportions, a man of perfect nerve and perfect aim and superhuman courage, and he dressed the McCanley's killings in every cliché the dime novels had to offer. In his version, Hickok had stood alone against the gang, armed with a pistol, a rifle, and a great Bowie knife, had fought them hand to hand when his guns ran dry, had killed them one after another in a room awash with blood, and had walked out of it carrying 11 bullets in his body and a tangle of knife wounds. Besides, the lone survivor of the greatest one-man gunfight, as Nichols put it, in history. No man could take 11 bullets and a dozen knife slashes and walk out of a cabin to drink from a well. It did not happen. It could not have happened, but it read magnificently, and that, in the end, was the only test that mattered. At the center of it all, Nichols placed the Rock Creek killings, transformed past all recognition. The squalid debt dispute that had left 3 men dead became an epic. The late check became a Confederate plot. David McCandless, the bullying landlord owed his money, became the leader of a gang of desperados and horse thieves and cutthroats, 9 or 10 strong. And Duck Bill, the convalescing stable hand, became the lone hero who had cut them all down. And then there was the number, the line that would echo for 150 years. Wild Bill, Nichols wrote, with his own hands had killed hundreds of men. Of that, he added, I have not a doubt. Hundreds of men. Set that against the careful tally of the historian Joseph Rosa, who spent a lifetime in the records and concluded that Hickok killed 6 men in personal combat across his entire life, with a possible 7th. 6. The Harper's article inflated the real number by a factor of more than 100. It took a stable hand who had killed 1 man behind a curtain and 2 more men who were finished off with a hoe and a shotgun, and it crowned him the deadliest pistolier in the history of the world. Here is what almost never gets told. The lie did not go unchallenged. It was not the case that everyone believed it, and only modern historians, sifting the dust a century later, ever figured out the truth. The truth was shouted loudly at the time by people who knew. When the Harper's article appeared in early 1867, the newspapers of the frontier, the people who actually lived where Hickok lived and knew what he had and had not done, tore it apart. The Leavenworth Daily Conservative said flatly that the story of Wild Bill as told in Harper's was not easily believed thereabouts. The Springfield Patriot, in the very town where the Tutt killing had happened, ridiculed it. Papers in Atchison and elsewhere pointed out that the article was riddled with inaccuracies and that Hickok was lying when he claimed to have killed hundreds of men. The rebuttal was immediate, and it was public. The people closest to the facts said, in print, this did not happen, and it did not matter. That is the lesson buried in this story, and it is a lesson that has only become truer with time. The grand, thrilling national lie in the famous magazine traveled across the whole country and lodged in the American imagination forever. The accurate, irritated corrections in the frontier papers traveled a few counties and died. The legend was simply a better product than the truth, and the market took the better product. By the time the rebuttals were printed, Wild Bill Hickok was already a household name from coast to coast, and he would never be unfamous again. Stop and consider what had just happened, because it was genuinely new in the world. A national magazine had reached out across a continent, taken a real but obscure man, and in a single article transformed him into a celebrity, a household name, a hero with a number attached to him that everyone would repeat and no one would check. This was not the slow growth of folklore over generations, the way the legend of an Achilles or a Robin Hood accretes across centuries of retelling. This was fast, and it was industrial, and it was driven by profit. Wild Bill Hickok was, as near as we can tell, the first gunfighter the mass media ever manufactured, the prototype of a thing that would become utterly ordinary in the century to come, the famous for killing celebrity, the violent man sold as a product to people who would never meet him. Everything that followed in American culture, every outlaw and lawman turned into a marketable hero, every real act of violence dressed up and sold as entertainment, traces back in part to that February issue of Harper's, and to a young gambler in Springfield who was happy to sit for the interview. The machine had found its first great product, and the product, it turned out, was a willing collaborator. But it would be too easy, and it would be untrue to say that Hickok was only a victim of this machine, a simple man caught up in lies told about him by others, because Wild Bill Hickok was an active partner in the manufacture of Wild Bill Hickok. He gave Nichols those interviews. He told the stories, and in the years that followed, as his fame grew, he kept telling them, and he kept making them bigger. The proof is devastating, and it sits in a book published in 1883, near the end of his story rather than the start of it, drawn from accounts Hickok himself had given. In that telling, Hickok described the Rock Creek fight in his own voice, and he claimed to have killed 6 of the 10 members of the McCanley's gang, 2 of them in a knife fight after he was wounded. Listen to how he told it. "I got hold of a knife," he said, "and then I got kind of wild-like, and it was all cloudy, and I struck savage blows, following the devils up from one side of the room to the other and into the corners, striking and slashing until I knew everyone was dead. All of a sudden," he said, "it seemed like my heart was on fire. I was bleeding everywhere. I rushed out to the well and drank from the bucket, and then tumbled down in a faint. It is vivid. It is thrilling. and it is a lie from a man who killed one person behind a curtain. We can prove it is a lie because Hickok named his victims, and among the men he claimed to have slaughtered at Rock Creek were two of David McCandless's brothers, James and Jack Leroy McCandless. But Jack Leroy McCandless was not dead. He was alive and well in 1883, the very year the book appeared, living quietly as a respected citizen of Florence, Colorado. Hickok had added to his own legend the killing of a man who was, at that moment, walking around perfectly alive. There is no clearer proof that the legend of Wild Bill was, in part, an inside job. The first and most enthusiastic teller of tall tales about Wild Bill Hickok was Wild Bill Hickok. He was not the only man of his era to be built this way, and he would not be the last. The pattern Nichols set at Springfield would be run again and again on the frontier's other famous names. Buffalo Bill Cody, the boy Hickok had met in Bleeding, Kansas, would take the raw material of his own real life as a scout and buffalo hunter and turn it into an arena spectacle seen by millions, performing a version of the West that had never quite existed. And years after Hickok was dead, another lawman, Wyatt Earp, would live on into old age in the 20th century and cooperate with a writer on a biography so flattering and so embroidered that it made Earp a national hero in the era of the motion picture, his real and complicated record buried under a marble myth. These are stories we have told elsewhere on this channel, and they all rhyme. The frontier did not just produce gunfighters, it produced a machine for turning gunfighters into gods, and the men themselves often stood at the controls. And yet, and this is the part that keeps Hickok from being merely a fraud, the man could, in fact, handle a gun, and the real record of his life as a frontier lawman, stripped of the hundreds of imaginary corpses, is still the record of a genuinely dangerous and genuinely brave man. The truth did not need the lie. It was enough on its own. Consider who respected him and why. These were not gullible Easterners reading a magazine. These were the hardest and most dangerous men of the cattle frontier, men who killed for a living and could smell a fraud across a room, and they took Hickok seriously. John Wesley Hardin, who had a real and terrible body count and feared almost no one, sized up Hickok in Abilene and chose not to test him. The cool nerve in the records is real too. When a drunk leveled a rifle at him, Hickok did not panic and did not bluster. He thought fast and turned the man's own fear against him. When two soldiers pinned him to a saloon floor with a pistol against his skull, and that pistol misfired, he did not freeze. He killed his way out of it in a heartbeat. The legend lied about the scale of the man, multiplied him 100-fold, gave him hundreds of victims he never touched. But it did not invent him out of nothing. Underneath all the printed nonsense was a real frontiersman with real nerve and a real and rare gift for staying alive in rooms where most men would have died. That is the strange tragedy of it. He never needed the lie. The plain truth of James Butler Hickok was remarkable enough to stand on its own 2 feet. The machine gilded it anyway, because a true story has limits, and the machine had none. After the war and the Tutt killing, Hickok served for a time as a scout in the Indian Wars on the Kansas plains, riding at intervals for the cavalry, including Custer's famed 7th, the same Custer who would die at the Little Bighorn only weeks before Hickok died in Deadwood. And even in this period, the documents catch Hickok doing the thing he did best, which was burnishing his own record. In the summer of 1867, he told a newspaper reporter a stirring tale of leading a party of soldiers in pursuit of the men who had killed 4 people near Fort Harker, and of returning with 5 prisoners after killing 10 of the enemy. It made good copy. It was also, by the account of the men who were actually there, untrue in its essentials. The party had indeed set out. It had returned, as one witness dryly put it, without so much as seeing a live one, let alone killing 10. The pattern from Rock Creek was holding, a real event, a real expedition, and wrapped around it a body count that existed mostly in the telling. Hickok was not merely the passive subject of other men's lies. He was, again and again, the author of his own. Then he pinned on a badge in some of the hardest towns on the plains. Before the sheriff's star, he had worked as a deputy United States Marshal out of Hays City, chasing down Army deserters and men who had stolen government property, the unglamorous backbone of frontier law. On one such job in the spring of 1868, he was assigned to haul 11 captured deserters to Topeka for trial, and he asked the fort for a military escort. The soldier they sent to ride with him was a sergeant named William Cody. The 2 boys who had met in Bleeding, Kansas a dozen years before, the future legend and the future showman, were grown men now, riding the same dusty road again on the same errand, neither of them yet imagining that one would spend the next century selling the myth of the other. Cody would outlive Hickok by more than 40 years, and he would use those years in his own arena spectacles and his own ghost-written memoirs to keep his dead friend's legend alive and growing. The men who built Wild Bill Hickok were not all strangers with magazines. Some of them were the people who loved him. In 1869, Hickok was elected sheriff in Hays City, Kansas, a railroad town swimming in whiskey and violence, where 3 sheriffs had quit in the previous 18 months. There he killed 2 men in his first month, and the records of those killings are real, and they are sobering. The first was a man named Bill Mulvey, drunk and on a rampage, shooting out the mirrors and the whiskey bottles behind the bars, who leveled a cocked rifle at Hickok in the street. Hickok did not outdraw him in a fair contest. He tricked him. He waved his hand past Mulvey and shouted to imaginary men behind the drunk not to shoot him in the back, and when Mulvey, confused, wheeled his horse to face the threat that was not there, Hickok shot him through the head before he understood he had been fooled. The second was a cowboy named Samuel Strawhun, causing a disturbance in a saloon in the small hours of the morning, who made remarks against Hickok, and whom Hickok shot through the head. A coroner's jury, hearing evidence the record itself calls very contradictory, called it justifiable. The next summer, 2 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry jumped him in a saloon. One of them, named Lonergan, pinned Hickok to the floor, and the other, named Kyle, put a pistol to Hickok's ear and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. In that half-second of life handed back to him, Hickok got his own guns working, shot Lonergan in the knee, and shot Kyle twice, killing him. These are the real gunfights of Wild Bill Hickok. There are not hundreds of them. There are a handful, and almost none of them look like the legend. They look like a man surviving by trickery, by nerve, and by terrible luck, in rooms full of drunk and violent men who would happily have killed him. Lay them out in a row, and the contrast with the legend becomes almost unbearable. The magazine said hundreds killed in single combat by a peerless duelist. The record says a handful spread thin across a decade and won by a frightened, clever man any way he could win them. A drunk shot through the head after being fooled into turning around. A cowboy shot in a saloon over an insult. A soldier shot off him by a gun that misfired first. a man killed behind a curtain in a debt dispute, and, at the very end of it, a friend shot by mistake in the dark. There is no glory in that list. There is no clean duel in it but one. There is only a man doing terrible, necessary, ugly things to stay alive in an ugly time, and carrying the weight of them afterward. The legend took that man with his handful of grim and human killings and sold him to the country as a smiling angel of death who had slain hundreds and never lost a minute's sleep. The real Hickok lost plenty of sleep. The accidental killing of Mike Williams alone, by every account, haunted him to his grave. The legend felt nothing because the legend was not a man. It was a product, and products do not grieve. In the spring of 1871, Hickok took the hardest job of his life, Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, the wildest of all the Kansas cattle towns at the height of the great Texas trail drives. The streets filled every season with armed, drunk, exhausted cowboys looking for trouble, and Hickok kept the lid on the place by reputation as much as by force. To understand the job is to understand the era. Every summer, herds of longhorn cattle came up the trails from Texas, driven hundreds of dusty miles by young men who had spent weeks in the saddle, eating dust and sleeping on the ground. And at the end of it, they hit a town like Abilene with money in their pockets and a powerful thirst for whiskey, cards, and a fight. The cattle money built the town, and the cattle crews very nearly tore it apart, season after season. The man hired to stand between the boomtown and the chaos held one of the most dangerous and thankless jobs on the frontier, and Abilene had already buried his predecessor, Tom Smith, killed serving a warrant. Hickok took the badge knowing all of that. For a single violent season he wore it and survived, mostly by being a man the cowboys did not care to test. The young killer, John Wesley Hardin, a man who really had killed dozens, passed through Abilene that year and came away, by his own account, respecting Hickok and unwilling to test him. For a whole season the marshal held the line, and then, on a single October night, it all came apart, and it came apart in the way that would haunt Hickok for the rest of his days. The trouble had a petty and almost comic origin, which is fitting because so much frontier violence did. There was a saloon in Abilene called the Bull's Head, owned by a Texas gambler named Phil Coe and his partner, the gunman Ben Thompson. As an advertisement, the two men had painted on the side of their establishment a picture of a bull, anatomically exaggerated in a way the respectable citizens of Abilene found obscene. The townspeople complained to their marshal. Hickok asked Coe and Thompson to paint the offending bull over. They refused. So Hickok altered the picture himself, and Phil Coe, humiliated, conceived a hatred for the marshal that would fester all season and end in gunfire. Thompson, for his part, tried to talk Hardin into killing Hickok, telling the young Texan that Wild Bill was a Yankee who liked to pick on rebels. Hardin, who had no love for Hickok's badge, but a clear-eyed respect for the man behind it, gave an answer that has come down through the years. "If Bill needs killing," Hardin said, "why don't you kill him yourself?" Nobody did, not that season. The reckoning, when it came by accident. On the night of the 5th of October, 1871, Coe had filled the streets with drunken cowboys, and a gun went off. Hickok came out to face the crowd. Coe had fired a shot, claiming he was only shooting at a stray dog, and then, in the confrontation, Coe turned his pistol on Hickok. Hickok was faster. He drew and fired and put 2 balls into Coe's belly, a wound that would kill the man slowly over the next several days. And in that same instant, in the chaos and the lamplight and the press of the armed crowd, Hickok caught a glimpse of a man rushing toward him from the side, a figure moving fast in the dark. Hickok spun and fired twice on pure instinct. The man was Mike Williams. He was a special deputy, a young officer who had been working that summer as a jailer for the town, and he was running toward Hickok not to attack him, but to help him. He was Hickok's own man, coming to his aid, and Hickok shot him dead in the street by mistake, in the glare of the kerosene lamps, before he could see who it was. Williams had been planning to leave Abilene that very night to go back to Kansas City and his ailing wife. Instead, he was killed by the man he was running to save. It broke something in Hickok that never healed. He paid for Williams' funeral. He is said to have carried the man's body himself and to have gone to Kansas City to face the widow and tell her what he had done. And the most telling fact of all, the fact that tells you what this killing did to him, is this. Mike Williams was the last man Wild Bill Hickok ever shot, the deadliest gunfighter in the legend, the man Harper said had killed hundreds, never fired a gun at another human being again for the remaining 5 years of his life. Within 2 months, Abilene relieved him of his badge. He was 34 years old, and his life as a fighting lawman was over. But the legend, by then, had a life entirely its own, and it did not need him anymore. It would keep growing long after the real man had laid down his guns, and even, soon enough, long after the real man was dead. What happens to a legend when the man inside it starts to wear out? In Hickok's case, what happened was a slow, almost unbearable decline, played out in public, while the printed myth of him only grew brighter. The first thing to go was the showman's dream of cashing in. Hickok understood that he was famous now, and like Buffalo Bill, he tried to turn the fame into money by performing a version of himself on a stage. In 1872, he gathered up some buffalo and a bear and a monkey and a few cowboys and native performers and took them to Niagara Falls for an outdoor spectacle he called the Daring Buffalo Chase of the Plains. It was a disaster. Because the show was outdoors, he could not make the crowd pay, and the whole thing collapsed financially. And at one performance, a buffalo refused to cooperate until Hickok fired a shot into the air, which only panicked the animals into breaking through their flimsy fencing and stampeding toward the audience. People were trampled. It was a farce, and it lost money, and it was about as far from the legend of the cool and deadly Wild Bill as a man could get. The next year, 1873, his old friend Buffalo Bill Cody, who had a real gift for show business that Hickok plainly lacked, invited him to join a touring stage production, a melodrama of the plains called Scouts of the Plains. And here the contrast between the legend and the man becomes almost painful to watch. Wild Bill Hickok, the supposed master of nerve and presence, was a miserable failure on the stage. He could not act. He could barely speak his lines. He hid behind the scenery whenever he could, and in one performance, when a stagehand aimed a spotlight at him, the most famous gunfighter in America did the only thing that came naturally. He shot the light out. He was released from the company after only a few months. There is something almost unbearably sad in that image, and it is worth holding on to, because it is the legend and the man standing side by side in the same body at the same moment. Out in the country, in 1,000 parlors and bunkhouses, Wild Bill Hickok was at the height of his fame, the deadliest pistolier alive, the slayer of hundreds, a name that made men shiver. And here was the actual man who owned that name, standing on a stage in the glare of the lights he could no longer bear to look at, unable to remember his lines, hiding behind painted scenery, so miserable and so out of place that when the spotlight found him, he answered it with a bullet. The myth had never been bigger. The man had never been smaller. They would go on diverging like that until the end, the printed legend swelling year by year, while the real Hickok shrank toward poverty and blindness and an early grave, until finally the two would have almost nothing to do with each other at all. One man who knew him said Hickok had to give it up because the bright stage lights hurt his eyes. And that detail is not a small one, because Hickok's eyes were the next thing to fail. From about 1871 until the end of his life, Hickok's vision was going. For a man whose whole survival had depended on seeing fast and seeing clearly, it was a sentence of doom, and he knew it. In 1876, he went to an eye specialist in Kansas City looking for help. And here the honest historian has to stop and admit how little we actually know. No firm diagnosis from that visit has survived. Later writers have guessed at everything from glaucoma to the lingering effects of disease. But the truth is that we cannot say for certain what was stealing the sight from the most famous eyes in the West. A specialist in the history of frontier eye disease once observed that granular eye infections, the things they called ophthalmia and trachoma, were simply common out west in those years, that the outlaw Jesse James suffered from the same kind of affliction, and that we should be cautious about pinning a precise modern label on a 19th century frontiersman's failing eyes. So we will not pretend to certainty the records do not give us. We only know that it was happening, that he was 39 years old, that his marksmanship and his health were both slipping, and that the man who had once been able to hit a target across a town square was now sometimes arrested for nothing grander than vagrancy, broke, and adrift, living on a reputation that had long outrun the reality. Those last years were a slow drift downward, and there is no way to dress them up. The badge was gone. The cattle town marshal who had once held the line in Abilene now had no town and no line to hold. The showman's ventures had failed. He had no land, no steady trade, and eyes that were closing on him a little more each season. He wandered the West, from Kansas to Wyoming to Missouri and back, living by the cards, trading on the name, a famous man with nothing famous left to do. Consider the cruelty of it from his side. Everywhere he went, men wanted to see Wild Bill Hickok, the deadliest gun alive, the slayer of hundreds. And what they got was an aging, half-blind gambler living on credit and reputation, knowing better than anyone in the room how wide the gap had grown between the name on the poster and the man wearing it. He was a legend, and legends do not get to grow old gracefully and fade into a quiet farm. The legend wants the dramatic end, and the West would give him one. But first, it would let him wander a while, watching his own myth tower over him while the real man ran out of road. There was one bright thing in those last years, and it was real. In Abilene, back in 1871, Hickok had met a remarkable woman named Agnes Thatcher Lake, a widow who owned and ran her own traveling circus, a genuinely formidable person in her own right. They had met in the most ordinary way imaginable. Lake had brought her circus to Abilene, and as the law required, she went to the office of the town marshal to pay the fee for performing in his town. The marshal was Wild Bill Hickok. She paid her fee, and her circus moved on the next day, but the two of them did not forget each other. For years afterward, the gunfighter and the circus proprietor wrote letters back and forth across the long distances of the West, two people of unusual lives keeping a thread between them, and in March of 1876, in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, James Butler Hickok married her. He was 39. She was older, in her 40s, a woman who had spent her life under canvas and knew exactly what kind of man she was taking on. And then, a few months after the wedding, he left her and went off with a wagon train toward the new gold strike in the Black Hills, chasing one last fortune in a place called Deadwood. He may have hoped to strike it rich and send for her. He may have simply been a restless man doing what restless men do. But before he went, or shortly after, he wrote her a letter that reads now like a man who already knew. "Agnes, darling," he wrote, "if such should be that we never meet again, while firing my last shot, I will gently breathe the name of my wife, Agnes, and with wishes even for my enemies, I will make the plunge and try to swim to the other shore." He had told his friend Charlie Utter, plainly, that he thought he would be killed in Deadwood. Deadwood in the summer of 1876 was the wildest place in America, and it sat at the dead center of one of the great broken promises of the West. The Black Hills had been guaranteed to the Lakota by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, sacred ground, off limits to white settlers by the solemn word of the United States government. Then, in 1874, an army expedition led by George Custer pushed into those hills and came back announcing that there was gold in them, and the treaty might as well have been written on water. Miners flooded in by the thousands in open defiance of the law and the nation's given word, and Deadwood boiled up out of the gulch overnight, a lawless camp of saloons and gambling halls and mud, sitting illegally on stolen land. The flood of trespassers ignited a war, the Great Sioux War, the conflict in which the Lakota and Cheyenne, defending the country promised to them, destroyed Custer and 5 companies of his 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn. That happened on the 25th of June, 1876. Wild Bill Hickok, who had once scouted for that same Custer, was shot dead in Deadwood just 5 weeks later. The two famous deaths, the soldier on the Montana Ridge and the gunfighter at the card table, fell almost on top of each other, 2 endings to 2 legends in a single bloody summer. And the camp where Hickok died had no legitimate courts and no real government, sitting in territory that on paper was still unorganized Indian country. It was, in the most literal sense, a town outside the law. That detail will matter enormously before this story is over. Into that camp, in July of 1876, came Wild Bill Hickok, riding in with Charlie Utter's wagon train, his eyes failing and his purse nearly empty, to make his living the only way left to him at the poker tables. He arrived in the same company as a hard-living frontier woman named Martha Jane Cannery, better known as Calamity Jane. And here we have to pause and pull down one more piece of the legend, because the romance between Wild Bill and Calamity Jane is one of the most beloved stories of the Old West, and it is almost certainly a fiction. Calamity Jane herself, years later, claimed that she had been married to Hickok, that she had even borne his child and divorced him so that he could marry Agnes Lake. There is no record to support any of it. As far as the documents show, the two of them may have met for the first time only on that very wagon train to Deadwood in the last weeks of his life, when she joined the group after being turned loose from military custody at Fort Laramie. There was no marriage, no child, no grand frontier romance. There was, at most, a few weeks of acquaintance at the end of his road. The men who buried Calamity Jane decades later, when she asked to be laid to rest beside Hickok, admitted privately that they did it as a joke, because in life Hickok had wanted nothing to do with her. And yet the romance has proved one of the most stubborn fictions of all, because Hollywood fell in love with it, building whole films and a famous musical around the doomed love of Wild Bill and Calamity Jane, two real and lonely people welded together forever by a story that never happened. The great love story is a tall tale built on the same ground as all the others. The truth was lonelier than that. There is a small, sad detail about his weapons that tells the whole story of his decline. In his prime, the pistolier of the legend had carried a matched pair of Colt Navy revolvers, .36 caliber cap and ball guns with ivory grips, and his name engraved on the backstrap, and he wore them in the old way, butt forward in a sash, drawing them with a practiced cavalry twist. Those were the guns of the legend. But the West was changing under him, and the records suggest that by the time he died, the aging, failing Hickok was carrying a smaller, more modern weapon, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson, the kind of gun a careful man keeps close. It hardly mattered which gun he had on the 2nd of August. He never got the chance to touch it. What happened next is, in its plain facts, the opposite of everything the legend promised. There was no duel. There was no fair fight. There was no warning. On the 1st of August, a drunken drifter sat down at Hickok's poker table. His name was Jack McCall, though he was using a false one, and he was a failed gambler, a young man of about 23 out of Kentucky who had drifted west to hunt buffalo and ended up broke in the Gulch. McCall played badly and lost everything he had, and Hickok, of all things, was kind to him. He told McCall to quit until he could cover his losses, and he gave the younger man money to buy himself breakfast. McCall took the money, and somewhere in his soaked and resentful brain, he decided the kindness was an insult. The next day, the 2nd of August, 1876, Hickok came back to the saloon, Nuttall and Mann's number 10, to play again. For his entire adult life, Hickok had followed one ironclad rule. He sat with his back to the wall where he could watch the door, because he knew that the only way a man like him would ever die was from behind. On this day, the corner seat was taken. A player named Charles Rich had it, and twice Hickok asked Rich to trade places with him, and twice Rich refused. And so, for the first and last time, Wild Bill Hickok sat down at a card table with his back to the door. It was, the records say plainly, a fatal mistake. Think about what that seat meant to him. For 15 years, the habit of watching the door had been as automatic as breathing, the one discipline that separated the living gunfighter from the dead one. He knew, better than any man alive, that someone like him would never fall in a fair fight in the open. He would fall the way Mike Williams fell, the way so many had fallen, from a direction he was not looking. He had said as much to Charlie Utter that he expected to die in Deadwood. He had written it, in a fashion, to Agnes. And now here he was, with his eyes failing and his luck run thin, sitting in the one chair in the room that broke his only rule, with his back to the open door of a saloon in the most lawless town in America. We do not know what he was feeling as he picked up his cards. We only know that the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding was standing, by the laws of chance, directly behind him, and that he could not see it coming, and that this time no trick and no nerve and no quickness would save him, because the danger was not in front of him where a fast hand could meet it. It was behind him, at the bar, ordering a drink. Jack McCall came into the saloon and ordered a drink at the bar. He drifted down along the bar until he was standing a few steps behind Hickok, as casually as a man glancing at a friend's cards. Hickok never saw him. He was looking at his hand, complaining to another player about a bad beat. "The old duffer," Hickok said. "He broke me on the hand." Those were his last words. McCall raised a single-action revolver, shouted, "Damn you, take that," and shot James Butler Hickok in the back of the head at point-blank range. Hickok died instantly. The bullet passed clean through his skull and out his right cheek, and it kept going, and it struck another player at the table, a riverboat captain named William Massey, in the wrist, where he would carry it for the rest of his life. That was the death of Wild Bill Hickok. Not a duel, not a fair fight. A drunk drifter, a borrowed grudge, a single shot in the back of the head while he sat with bad cards in his hand and his guard down for the only time in his life. The deadliest gunfighter in the legend never even turned around. And now we come to the most famous detail of all, the one piece of the death that everyone knows, the dead man's hand. The story goes that when Hickok was shot, the cards that fell from his hands were 2 black aces and 2 black eights, and that ever since, poker players the world over have called that pair of pairs the dead man's hand. It is on monuments. It is in 100 films. It is the single most famous hand in the history of cards. And it may not be true. Here is what the documents show. The newspaper reports written in the days right after the killing, the accounts set down while the body was barely cold, focused on the murder and said nothing about any particular hand of cards. No coroner's record, no sheriff's note from that week lists the aces and eights. The famous hand does not appear in the contemporary record at all. It surfaces only later, growing over the following decades through retellings and poker columns and Western novels, and the most specific version of it traces back through a chain of secondhand memory, a story one man told another decades after the fact. Even the identity of the 5th card has never been settled and is debated to this day. The truth is that we do not actually know what Wild Bill Hickok was holding when he died. The single most famous fact about his death was very likely assembled, like the rest of the legend, after he was already in the ground, because a great death deserved a great hand, and if history would not supply one, then storytelling would. The man who killed him gave the legend one last twist. After the single shot that killed Hickok, McCall wheeled on the rest of the stunned room and pulled the trigger again and again, trying to fight his way clear, and every remaining cartridge in his pistol failed to fire. Whether by faulty loads or sheer chance, the gun that had just murdered the most famous gunfighter in America would not shoot a second time, and the men in the saloon lived because of it. McCall ran out the back, tried to flee on a horse whose saddle had come loose, fell off into the street, and was caught within minutes, the assassin of Wild Bill Hickok, brought down not by a posse, but by a slipped cinch. And then Deadwood, that lawless camp, did something. That perfectly captured what kind of place it was. It put McCall on trial the very next day before an informal jury of miners and businessmen in a theater. McCall claimed he had killed Hickok in revenge, that Wild Bill had murdered his brother back in Abilene. There is no good evidence the brother ever existed, and the miners' jury, in that town with no real legal standing, listened to the tale and found Jack McCall not guilty. They let the murderer of Wild Bill Hickok walk free. The local paper wrote, in disgust, that should it ever be their misfortune to kill a man, They would simply ask that the trial be held in one of these mining camps. Why Jack McCall really killed Wild Bill Hickok is a question that has never been answered, and McCall himself did not help because his story kept changing. At the miners' trial, he said it was revenge for a brother killed in Abilene, but a brother nobody could ever confirm existed. At other times, the likeliest explanation seemed to be the smallest and the saddest one: simple wounded pride, the resentment of a drunk and broke young man who had been handed breakfast money by a famous gambler and decided the kindness was a humiliation he could not bear. But there were darker possibilities, and McCall fed them too. After his conviction, he claimed that he had been paid to do it, that a gambler named John Varnes had hired him to kill Hickok. Varnes could not be found. Then McCall named another man, Tim Brady, as part of the plot. Brady had vanished from Deadwood as well. Whether there was ever a conspiracy of gamblers who feared a man like Hickok bringing law and order to their lawless camp, or whether McCall was simply a frightened liar grasping at any story that might delay the rope, we will never know. The man who killed the most famous gunfighter in America took his real reasons to the gallows with him. But the lawlessness of Deadwood, the very thing that freed McCall, was also what doomed him. Because Deadwood's court had no legal authority, its verdict had no legal weight, and that meant the case was not closed. When McCall left and drifted into Wyoming and began bragging in the saloons about how he had killed Wild Bill in a fair fight, the federal authorities took notice. They arrested him again, and because the first trial in Deadwood had never been a real trial in the eyes of the law, trying him a second time was not double jeopardy. He was taken to Yankton, the capital of the Dakota Territory, and given a real trial before a real court in December of 1876. This time, no witnesses were called for his defense. This time, the jury found him guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to hang. On the 1st of March, 1877, Jack McCall was hanged in Yankton. He was about 24 years old, the first man ever executed by federal authority in the Dakota Territory. They buried him, and when the cemetery was moved a few years later and his body was dug up, they found that the noose was still around his neck. They had buried him in the rope that hanged him. Hickok's own resting place became, fittingly, one more strange chapter in the legend that would not let him rest. His friend Charlie Utter claimed the body and gave him a funeral that nearly the whole camp attended. Utter, who went by the name Colorado Charlie, did right by his dead friend in a way the legend tends to forget. He placed a notice in the Black Hills Pioneer announcing the death and inviting the whole camp to the funeral, and almost the entire town turned out. This lawless gulch of miners and gamblers and outcasts pausing its frantic hunt for gold to bury the most famous man who had ever walked its single muddy street. And on the wooden marker over the grave, Utter had words carved that were not the words of a legend at all, but of a man grieving a friend. Pard, the marker read, "We will meet again in the happy hunting ground to part no more." Goodbye, Colorado Charlie. There is more real feeling in that one rough sentence than in all the dime novels ever printed about Wild Bill Hickok. He was buried first in Deadwood's original graveyard, and then, 3 years later, moved up the hill to the new cemetery at Mount Moriah. When they dug him up to move him, the men who did it found something uncanny. Hickok had been poorly embalmed, and the minerals in the soil had seeped into the body and slowly turned it to something like stone, so that when a man tapped the corpse with his cane, it rang hard, like tapping a brick wall. The legend had become literally petrified. They reburied him at Mount Moriah, and over the years, souvenir hunters whittled his wooden grave marker to splinters, and then defaced the statue that replaced it, and then defaced the next one, chipping away pieces of Wild Bill to carry home, the way the dime novels had been chipping away pieces of the real man for decades. Even his grave could not be left whole. And here is the cruelest irony of all. His death did not slow the legend down. It set it free. While Hickok was alive, there was always the inconvenient real man, the half-blind gambler, the failed actor, the penitent who emptied his pockets for a widow, standing in the way of the myth. And now that man was gone, turned to stone in a hillside grave, unable to contradict anything. So the storytellers let loose. Within a few years of his murder came whole books with titles like Wild Bill the Scout and Heroes of the Plains, each one taller and freer with the truth than the last, piling invented adventures onto the dead man by the dozen. Then came the next century, and the movies, more than a dozen of them, with the greatest stars of their day strapping on the long-barreled pistols to play a Wild Bill Hickok who had less and less to do with James Butler Hickok of Troy Grove, Illinois. The aces and eights became shorthand the whole world understood. The quick-draw duel he had fought exactly once became the thing everyone assumed he did every week. The dead man could not object, and so the legend, finally unburdened of the man, grew to a size the living Hickok could never have imagined and never could have borne. So how many men did Wild Bill Hickok really kill? The writer in Harper's said hundreds, and Hickok himself, late in his life, was still adding fictional corpses to the pile, claiming men dead who were alive enough to read about their own murders in the newspaper. But the historian who gave his life to the records, Joseph Rosa, came to a number that fits inside a single sentence. 6 men in personal fights across 10 years, a 7th possibly. That is the real ledger of the deadliest gunfighter the West ever produced. Not hundreds, 6. And almost none of those 6 fell in anything resembling the duels of the legend. 1 was shot through a curtain. 2 were tricked into turning their heads. 1 was a man who had a pistol to Hickok's ear when the gun, by pure chance, failed to fire. The legend sold a fantasy of clean, fair, masterful killing. The reality was survival by nerve and trickery and luck in dark rooms full of dangerous men by a person who was himself often frightened, often outnumbered, and in the end going blind. What is left of all this now when the dime novels have crumbled and the magazines have yellowed? More than you might think, and the truest pieces of it have nothing to do with gunfights at all. In Springfield, Missouri, the watch over which Davis Tutt died was reclaimed, and Tutt himself was buried, and years later his body was moved and reburied by his half-brother. That half-brother was named Lewis Tutt, and he had been born into slavery, the son of Davis Tutt's own father and an enslaved woman. And Lewis Tutt did something with his freedom that no dime novel would ever have thought to print. He became, in 1874, the first African-American police officer in Springfield, and by the end of his life, he was one of the wealthiest men in the city and a known philanthropist. The man Wild Bill killed has been remembered only as a name in a famous gunfight. But out of that same wounded family came a man who put on a badge in a town that had every reason to deny him one and lived a life worth far more than a footnote. Every life in this story mattered, including the ones the legend used only as scenery. And out at Rock Creek, the family of David McCandless, the bully who teased a stable hand and died for a late payment, scattered and went on. His 12-year-old son Monroe, who watched his father die and was forbidden by a judge to tell what he had seen, carried the true story his whole life, and in his old age he finally got to tell it to the one man who could carry it to the world. In 1908, by an extraordinary turn, Monroe McCandless found himself a guest in the same house as Buffalo Bill Cody, and there, more than 40 years after the killing, the dead man's son told Wild Bill's old friend exactly what had happened behind that curtain. Cody, who had spent his life selling the myth of the West, heard the truth from the only eyewitness left alive, and was struck enough to want to set it down. And the line of David McCandless ran on, down through the generations, in a direction no one at that bloody station could ever have dreamed. His descendants served their country in war and earned its highest honors, and his great-great-grandson, a man named Bruce McCandless, became an astronaut, and in 1984 he climbed out of a space shuttle wearing a jetpack and floated free, untethered, alone against the black, the first human being in history to fly in open space attached to nothing at all. From a debt dispute at a Nebraska creek that left a man dead in a doorway, to a descendant of that same man hanging weightless above the whole earth, the frontier did not end. It just kept going straight up, out past the edge of the sky. The legend goes on too, of course. Every summer in Deadwood, in the streets where he died, actors reenact the murder of Wild Bill Hickok and the capture of Jack McCall for the tourists. The same way they have done for 100 years, the death replayed forever as entertainment. Up the hill at Mount Moriah, Hickok lies under a cast-iron fence with a flag flying beside him, and that flag, by a special act of Congress, never comes down, day or night, in honor of the veterans buried there. He is more famous in death than almost any man of his time. His face is on coins and posters and playing cards. The dead man's hand is known to people who have never heard his name. More than a century after a drunk shot him in the back of the head, the card players of the world voted him into their Hall of Fame, honoring him for a hand of cards that the contemporary record never actually recorded him holding. Think about the strangeness of that. We have built monuments, films, reenactments, and a place in the very mythology of poker around a detail of his death that we cannot prove, and that was very likely invented after the fact. The legend has so completely swallowed the man that we now commemorate him chiefly for things he may never have done, holding cards he may never have held, killing men who may never have died. But the uncomfortable truth underneath all the glory is this: the legend of Wild Bill Hickok was a machine, and like every machine that turns human beings into product, it had to grind something up to run. It ground up the 3 men at Rock Creek, turning a father, a cousin, and a hired hand into a faceless gang of cutthroats so that one man could be a hero. It ground up Davis Tutt, reducing a complicated man with a family and a future into a prop in someone else's quick draw. It ground up Mike Williams, the loyal deputy whose accidental death the legend has almost entirely forgotten, because a hero who kills his own friend by mistake does not sell as well as a hero who never misses. And in the end, it ground up Wild Bill himself, the real James Butler Hickok, the abolitionist son who emptied his pockets for a widow, the failing showman who shot out the stage lights, the half-blind, nearly broke, frightened man who wrote his wife a goodbye and went off to die in a lawless camp. The legend ate him too and left in his place a marble idol who never existed. He helped build that machine, That is the hardest and most human part of all. He sat for the interviews, he told the tales, he claimed the kills, and he fed the very engine that would flatten the real man into a myth. He was its first great product, and he was one of its willing engineers, and he could no more have stopped it than a man can stop a river he has helped to dig. 150 years later, the river is still running, and somewhere underneath it, in the trial records and the coroner's notes and the irritated little frontier newspapers that called the lie a lie while the lie was still wet on the page, the real man is still there, waiting for anyone willing to read. If this story moved you, leave a like so that more people can find the man behind the myth. Subscribe to Western Pioneer Archives, and thank you for spending this time with us on the frontier.